Hello and welcome to Setting the Stage, episode 25, Tommy and Oryn. We are looking for more people to interview, so if you're a DM or you know a DM that might be interested in coming on the show, you can check out more about how to apply at www.gocorral.com/sts. And without any further ado, let's get into the show. All right, today I'm here with Tommy, who's going to tell us about his world, but before we get into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are outside of D&D?
Sure. Hi, I'm Tommy Garber. I'm a director by trade, so I direct music videos, marketing stuff, all that really fun stuff that you used to see on MTV and don't anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm, transitioning into the TV and film world now, so hopefully in a little while you'll be able to see some of that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
What's like the biggest project that you think some of us might have seen?
Oh man, I haven't done anything huge, but most recent like big thing, a little over a year ago, I did a music video for the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones,
Okay,
who are a ska band. And if you're
I've
like,
heard of
oh,
them.
yeah, if you're like that sounds familiar, their one big hit was "The Impression That I Get." The impression that I get was like in every movie in the early 2000s. As soon
I
as you hear that,
remember it
yeah.
from the Digimon movie, yeah.
The Digimon movie has the greatest soundtrack of any 2000s animated film,
Yes.
maybe bar Shrek. But that the impression that I get is on there, and that is it's a banger of a track. And they had a new album coming out, so we shot a music video for them out in the desert with a bunch of guys in suits on mopeds. It was a great time. That track is called "I Don't Believe in Anything." And the video for The Impression That I Get is actually featured in it, which is really fun.
Oh,
That's it.
cool.
The video is pretty wild. We went for a pretty wild aesthetic. Definitely a fun one. And then I've done some like background or backyard show kind of stuff recently. Some really chill vibe, like acoustic folk sets and stuff like that turned out really great. Those aren't out quite yet, but those will be like the next thing coming around for me. So yeah.
Cool. So you're trying to get out of the smaller videos into something bigger like TV next?
Yeah, I spent the last year or so, 2 years, developing a show, a TV series with a really cool group of writers. It was an idea that I had in college and I had kind of been poking at for a long time, and finally came around and said, you know what, let's spend some time, let's write a pilot, let's flesh out the show. So we're shopping that around. Obviously, the writer's strike puts a little bit of a speed bump in that, but
Yep.
we're all very pro union, so we're patient, and we'll come back around. We had some progress going as far as like actually selling that, but now we'll see. But hopefully that'll be next, because I love that show. I'm very excited about it. So hopefully someday, come around and I'll send you an email and let you know. Check it out.
Okay, cool. Good luck with that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so when did you start playing D&D?
I started playing D&D in high school, maybe like middle school, when it wasn't cool to play D&D. I know this is like a pretty common topic of discussion for D&D folks, but like back when you would get you get bullied for being into D&D, it wasn't as cool as it is now in the pop culture, which I love. I know
Right.
some older guys kind of begrudge that it's like, oh, it's cool to play now. That sucks. But no, I think it's awesome. More people getting into it, and that's really fun. So I got in as a player initially, but really short lived as a player. I jumped right into DMing after like session 2 of playing, just because I really love storytelling, and I didn't know that was why when I was a kid. I just liked that aspect of it, but I kept doing that, and then in college sort of lost touch with it because I was in college and busy, and then I came back around to it in the pandemic, in the actual lockdown of it all.
Mhm.
And some friends who are sort of, dealing with the isolation of it the same way I was and having a hard time with that. And I thought, that's a good kind of thing to get back into. And we played an online campaign that lasted 2 years.
Cool. You didn't really DM when you were first playing. It was more like when you got back to it. Is that right?
I did DM when I first started playing. It was, I think I was a player for 1 or 2 sessions first, but I really quickly transitioned into DMing through high school and all of that, and then now DMing primarily. But I actually try really actively to be a player every now and then. I think it's really
Mhm.
good for a DM to be a player while they're DMing. not in their own campaign, but
Right, right.
but in someone else's campaign for a lot of reasons. For the gameplay aspect of it, to kind of remind yourself what you love about D&D and specifically as being a player, what's fun as a player and what keeps you engaged. And also, to see another DM's style, to see what you like and even honestly what you don't like sometimes can be really valuable when you're
Hmm.
DMing. And to have that active reminders is so helpful. And I got to play with a really awesome group of people online with a fantastic DM. We were doing a Descent into Avernus campaign, so
Right.
a module, but that DM was doing really great work with um, adding really unique details and things that were specific to us and sort of twisting to our path, which is the constant struggle of a DM with a group that hates railroading, and so
Hmm.
so that was really really valuable for me to kind of remind myself what's fun as a player and what DM strategies really click for me.
Gotcha. So in your survey, most of the other people talked about like specific worlds that they created and gave more details on that. And a lot of your answers were more about like your process for creation for the different campaign worlds that you've run. I was curious if you wanted to talk more about like process during this interview, or if you wanted to talk more about like a specific campaign world that you're more proud of.
Yeah, I've listened to a couple episodes since because I filled that survey out a while back, and then
Right. Yeah. Before I think we had like one episode out at that time. So.
yeah, and so I listened to a couple, and I was like, oh, I think I maybe answered this wrong. But I listened to Sarah's episode about the Elder Scrolls because I'm a big fan of working within a pre-existing IP. I think
Hmm.
that's so interesting. I thought this was a great episode, and Thessie's episode I thought was great as well. I just listened to that one, and
Yeah.
I'm super excited to listen to Garrett's with that single city setting. I think that's so cool to work within one space for a whole campaign. I'm really excited to listen to that one. But I'm
Yeah.
definitely
Look
yeah.
behind the veil. This is coming out.
Oh
The
yeah.
yeah the Garrett one came out today.
Yeah.
That we're recording right now.
Yeah, I'm very excited to listen to that one. And yeah, no, I think the I sent two maps of previous camp. Well, one is a previous campaign and one is a current. And I figure talking about Oryn, which is the current campaign, is a good way to kind of talk about the process as well. They kind of go hand in hand. Um, so we
Okay.
can talk about that one, and I'll pull back the process as we go through there.
Okay. Cool. Sounds good. Let's talk about Oryn. You want to give like a well, yeah, spelled Oryn. That's what I'm seeing here on
Yeah,
your.
yeah, that'll be the first dead giveaway that I'm a big fan of a random generator. That I think there's nothing wrong with making constant use of the internet, and Oryn came from a random generator. I struggle with names as a DM, mostly just the insane amount of names for things that you need to have,
Oh yeah, there is a
places and
lot.
people and every item and every legend and everything. You really start to go through the lexicon. So I am a big fan of a random generator, even if it's you pull something out and then you break it apart. I think Oryn was a longer one, and I just chopped off the second syllable. I like something a little bit more clear. But Oryn in general is a really standard D&D fantasy world, and I like to kind of pick and choose and then simplify from D&D, lore that's out
Hmm.
there. So as far as like our pantheon of gods, first I start with what the players, what they're playing, and I say, choose any D&D god, or if there's something that's non-standard that you want to use, let me know. We can talk about it. And then I
Hmm.
take those and I add a couple more gods here and there, and then I have a sort of simplified pantheon. Right now we have 15 gods in this one, five who are in the sort of space of good, five in the space of kind of gray, and then five in the space of traditionally evil. And so we don't have those 200 plus D&D gods in there, and the rest of the world is similar. I kind of streamline a little bit. So we have a sort of traditional melting pot capital, large city in the middle, and then I spread out from there, smaller towns here and there, and I kind of build the lore around each space.
Right.
Oryn had a war about 100 years ago from when we are playing in our current group between a mind flayer who enslaved normal people to be its soldiers and the normal people, and that war wasn't actually supposed to be the focus of our campaign. I don't start out with a big bad in mind.
Mhm.
I really like to let my players dictate what the focus and the theme of our world is. So I like to set a little history so that the world has context, why things feel a little bit new, a little bit, new world-ish for the players, so
Mhm.
that they're not jumping into something that's too old and too established um, to be understandable. And so that war was kind of that. It was sort of a reset point for the world.
Okay.
There's a lot of history there for them. They really bit into that. That was the part that seemed the most interesting to them of a lot of the other lore that was there. So I gave a couple hooks, and that was the one they jumped onto. So now we're doing sort of the fallout of that and the possible reemergence of this mind flayer as our big
Okay.
bad, which is a lot of fun.
The new empire like gives this indication that, or new government, that the players can sort of forge their own way and have larger influence than you might expect at a more established government where a level 1 character probably can't do that much.
Yeah, and you're starting with any new group and a new world that's homebrew, you're starting with a lot of information to throw at a player, and so for that sort of re-exploring of a world, the world is still in the process of reconnecting. The capital is still sort of reestablishing outreach to these smaller towns and all of that. And some towns are still rebuilding their culture and their world. I think that's a really good way to let the characters ask questions that are relevant to that and build their knowledge while you build the world. I'm also not a huge fan of the pre-campaign novel, if you know what I mean. Um,
Yes.
I I don't love that. I don't mind if a player writes a large document for their character. I enjoy that, and any investment from a player is great. But I don't like to give so much homework that it's daunting, so much to understand that it feels like you're going to be quizzed. So I like to throw you into the world in a way where you have a couple quick facts about where your character came from, the town they're from, the people they know, and then we sort of build that as we go. If we're going back to the town that you're from, we'll add a couple characters in together. We'll do a little side conversation of who are you going to be
Mhm.
looking for, who do you know, and that way you
Right.
make them feel more connected to the world, and they know that those pieces are out there even if they don't know specifically what they are yet.
Yeah. Yeah. I was gonna say, from reading your survey, it looked like you were doing a lot of like dungeon world style creation of your world, where you give like a little bit, and then your players sort of fill in the rest of the map and the rest of like the country descriptions and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of player involvement for world creation. I really love. I don't know if you know, like Wander Home is a indie tabletop game, and Wander Home, Jay Dragon made that. Wander Home is like your whole group sort of decides what the world is going to be. You don't really have a DM in
Hmm.
that, and I think that kind of system is so wonderful. And there's a line, obviously, for a campaign like this where you need a DM to decide enough to really give you the world to play in, but to let your players kind of establish facts as you go, and in that same way, building lore and world facts through random generators, through the party being involved. Like one of our sort of background facts is that instead of ravens or owls for your mail, our mail is done by grebes, which are sort of ducks, I guess,
Okay.
which came from a random generator, and our group has sort of started to call the mail system their Gmail because it's grebe mail, which is just
Okay.
like an accidental joke that I couldn't have possibly written. And so those sorts of things that the players bring, and in their character creation as well. Each character kind of brought facts about their hometown in. One of our players is playing an Owlin, and he really wanted to have a world that was um, Owlin and their beasts of burden. Their instead of horses and things, they have dinosaurs.
Okay.
And I thought that was such a fun little detail. And so
Yeah.
we
Classic Dinotopia.
I love Dinotopia. I mean, if I could mimic that art style for a full campaign, that would be phenomenal. But yeah, that sort of idea is really fun, and each player really dictated the town that they came from, or for one of them, a religious sort of background and those sort of things. We really build that together in our character creation sessions, which I do individually before we start the actual play at all.
I was wondering how much of you feel like the creation is like you versus your players versus random generators,
Yeah,
like you said.
I think it would be like 80%. I'll say 70% me, 20% my players, 10% random generators. If you're looking at the Oryn map, I build this map, sort of the geography of it. I put, 90% of these towns on here. And even if that's just a name, that town isn't developed, I just know, I'll want one more town in this area. I'll want something that works as sort of a mysterious forest, as something that works as an ancient battlefield, something that works as the Magic Academy, things like that, sort of stereotypical landmarks to build around later. And then
Mhm.
I'll go in and say, hey, what kind of atmosphere do you think your character grew up in? And sometimes that becomes, well, none of the things that I have on here really fit that. Let's build something new. So I have a town at the south end of this map called San Citlan, and that is fully a player decided town. Almost everything about that town is built by a player. And he's playing a fantastic Nacho Libre inspired monk character,
Okay.
which I absolutely love. I have a great group this time around. They're so creative. And so that little town is all, his mind, and it's played a lot into his character specifically, the kind of person that his character is.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I was seeing a lot of Spanish inspiration in that
Yeah,
quadrant of the map.
that's mostly him. I don't speak Spanish. I speak English and Japanese, which in this setting is not very useful.
Hmm.
But yeah, he's brought that in a bit, and it's really added a particular charm to saying like, hey, this region of the map has a sort of linguistic background that I'm not familiar with, but comes through very easily. I mean, I grew up in San Diego, so I'm familiar with Spanish. I just don't speak it.
Right.
And so it really does add sort of a geographical divide in a way that I don't usually dig into too much. I don't do like a one continent that's only elves. I don't do a lot of
Mm-hmm.
that. And so this is really kind of leaned into that a bit. And so I geographically I cut it off as well, so it has like a forest that sort of divides it from the rest of the continent, so that during that war 100 years ago, it might not have been directly affected too much. And
Gotcha.
so that way it has its own little mythos and its own background.
Okay. Yeah. Why don't you give us like a physical description of the world?
Yeah, so this map is basically broken up into four chunks of continent. They're connected by small bridges or really small slivers of land, except for one, which is currently completely obscured by, on the physical map, clouds. It's not actually obscured by clouds, but by distance, which is sort of a series of islands that have not been explored yet. But besides that, there's the Lernea, which is sort of a desert section of the continent. It is where our sort of elvish population comes from mostly. So there's a sort of elvish cities there. It's also where historically that mind flayer sort of set up base. So
Okay.
that area has been affected the most by that mind flayer. Then there's the sort of center part of the continent, which has our capital. It has our academy for magic users. It also has that sort of southern Spanish influenced section of town that we were talking about.
Hmm.
It has one of my favorite town names on here, which is Coastco, which is a big merchant city, um,
Cool.
and a bunch of sort of smaller towns that have a lot of different influences in here. Um, and then to the north of that, connected by a huge bridge, there are these two sort of ancient bridges that are miles and miles long of stone, and no one knows where they came from. Then there's the northern area, which is traditional D&D style. It is sort of the snowy, icy part of the map, the cold weather north, as you would have. And on the far corner of that, we have a town called Spember, Spember. And Spember is in all of my games. Any map that I have has a Spember. It's a silly name on purpose. Again, I think it came from a random generator. Um, but it's just sort of a standard uh, shipping town, a trade town, a really small but important port town. And it's always just a simple, fun starting point. And it gives me a lot of tools to play with that I already have established. And then I mix in some specific stuff for the new world that I'm playing in. There's a couple other, large mountain ranges. The capital is surrounded by a mountain range, kind of built into the corner there. There is a large mountain range that encircles an area called Sima Nublar, which is that dinosaur owlin town we talked about earlier.
Oh yeah.
So you can kind of see the Jurassic Park of the name there,
Yeah.
like the Isla Nublar, and yeah, and there are a smattering of ruins and towns. Some towns that have become ruins during that war and more recently, and I like to kind of divide it up into a few obvious, just by this is an incarnate map. You can tell very quickly this is an incarnate map. I'm not a
Hmm.
map maker myself.
Yeah.
But I try to color it in such a way that you can tell this area is a snowy, cold climate. This is a desert climate, and this is a little bit more of a temperate climate, that kind of thing. So you get a quick idea as a player when you're looking at it of what kind of area you're going into.
Okay. And what would you say it's like culturally? Is it like European, Chinese, African, or is it like vary between the different places?
That's a good question. I think it does kind of vary between the places. I think that as far as like genre, anything that is in the area of traditional D&D usually falls into European fantasy, right? You have that sort of
Right.
like not quite Middle Earth tone.
Hmm.
So I think in general it falls into that. I do like to allow a space to have its own architecture. So when we get into that Sunset Lawn City that we were talking about earlier, we'll probably develop an architecture that feels more unique, a sort of vibe that feels more appropriate to that character and their background. Um, but yeah, in general, I think that this is sort of a traditional European fantasy. We have like the dwarven towns, like Slate Hall in the middle. There's like a big dwarven town built into a mountain, very old school dwarf. But then also we have some sort of fun things in here. If maybe we'll circle back to this. I don't want to spoil things for my players. I'll put a little halfway mark in here for my players of when they need to stop listening. But there are some other things in here that are a little bit more modern, that play on some concepts from uh, references and things like that. I'm struggling
Hmm.
not to do a spoiler there, but yeah, it's I would
Okay,
say
gotcha.
generally European fantasy, with variants of culture by culture.
Okay, cool, cool. I had a few questions about, well, a few different things I'm seeing on the map. One
Yeah,
would
sure.
be the desert elf continent. Um, does that have any connection to the Under the Burning Suns campaign in Westnoth?
Yeah, I'm actually not familiar with that, so so no. um,
Okay.
but but it wasn't actually a super intentional choice. I had sort of drawn out that island out there on the side connected by one large bridge to the mainland. Um, and I was just kind of thinking about what would be fun, different, like notably different as soon as you set foot in here. And I thought a big desert would be fun. And then I thought, well, I wanted the ruins of this old elven capital to be far away from everything else. And so I started sort of like worked its way in there. It wasn't really like, oh, I want the elves to be dune marching elves. Like that wasn't really a choice that I made early on. It was sort of a mix up that got me there.
All right, so not connected. The Under the Burning Suns campaign is where like your elves that are in the desert after the trees have all gone away in a future apocalypse.
I might have to check that out because we're starting to get to a point where I think we might journey out there in the near future, and any inspiration is always good.
Yeah. There's like two suns that circle the world now, and there's also a bunch of like aliens that are attacking them.
Yeah, we haven't quite gotten to the alien bit of a campaign here, but I don't mind a little random alien fun in there. It's one of my. I mean, I'm obviously you can always tell what games the DM is playing off on the
Mhm.
side. I'm playing the new Zelda right now, and
Yeah.
this is not a spoiler for Tears of the Kingdom at all because it's a Majora's Mask thing. But there's that quest in Majora's Mask where aliens show up and
Right.
they like abduct cows. Uh, and that's like one of those things that's always inspired me. Just like there's nothing wrong with throwing something goofy and silly in there and sort of off the wall for a one-off or for a side quest or whatever. And hey, fantasy, have an alien show up. I guess at that point it just feels like cosmic horror, but that's fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, and the final thing for that section is you called it Lernea. Is that any connection to like, there's like a Greek word for where that means like memory or something like that?
Sorry, that's a hell of a pull. Yes and no. That is a name steal from a previous campaign.
Okay.
Lernea was a part of a previous campaign, and we did the False Hydra
Uh-huh.
in Lernea. And if you're familiar with the False Hydra, maybe listeners aren't. The False Hydra is a creature that, when you are not looking at it, you can't remember it, and it will feed on a town. And as it eats people, they are forgotten, and it sings a song that sort of persists this power.
Hmm.
And so we had a group who went into this town and we played the false hydra. They didn't know what was going on. And we played this really fun twist where about halfway into this, they kind of start to realize what's going on, and they realize that they came to town with one more person than they have currently. And so I invented a fake PC who had been playing with them, not really, who is now gone forever and eaten, and they couldn't remember them. And that was sort of the reveal of that. And I love that town, and that name just sort of stuck with me. And so I brought it with, but it won't be a false Hydra town in this. I think layering a false Hydra with a mind flayer is just like that's too much.
Yes.
You don't want to stack up too much on them, and unless you're trying to end a campaign and then go for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's a good catch. I forgot what that meant, but that's absolutely what that is.
Yeah, that's the classic false hydra thing where you have a fake PC.
Yeah, oh yeah, I love it. And so that's like, I have no pride as a DM talking about random generators and the internet. There are so many amazing homebrew side quests and just things that you can plop into your campaign, and that's one of my favorite ones. I've done some sillier ones. There was one floating around a while ago that was like if Belle Delphine was a demon who was like, do you know who Belle Delphine is?
Sounds familiar, but I'm not.
She's an internet personality. She sold her bathwater. This was the big sort of drama back when this module joke went around. So she was selling her bathwater, and the joke was like, if a demon did that to a town and sort of like brainwashed a town by selling bathwater, basically. And so we did a bit about that in a campaign, because it was a little side quest module somebody just thrown up online, and those can be so fun to throw in.
Yeah, I've definitely thrown a few modules into my campaign in the past.
Yeah, if you're running a campaign right now and you have not run the False Hydra, don't tell your friends to listen to this episode. Tell them listen to all the other ones. Go home, figure out how to throw a False Hydra in your campaign. It's a blast to really because it makes your players question every town they go to after that. I mean, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I had two more questions about the map that I'm looking at here. One of them is that you have got this like skull with an octopus on top of it symbol that's in a couple different places on your map. Are those like old mind flayer?
Yeah, it's exactly what it is. So like I said, this is an incarnate map. So, you're working with the resources that are on there, and I could pull it into Photoshop and do something custom, but every now and then you're a little lazy. So I did a skull with a octopus head just stamped on top of it, and that's our sort of mind flayer historical site. So ruins that were related specifically to the mind flayer war are these skulls with an octopus head on them.
Cool. I'm also seeing there's a town in the bottom right called Mir or Mur, which is popular in the little Discord channel where we're talking about different things at the moment. The word Mir is. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
I saw that, and that conversation in the Discord kind of jumped out at me because I had done that again. I think either from a generator or from just cutting it out of another word, like Myrmidon or anything like that. That's a town that I haven't actually dug into too much. It's I wanted to have a neighboring town to that San Sitlan that was a little bit more connected to the rest of the world, and so it's a port town. But that's about all that I have for that one.
Okay.
You're gonna catch me in a lot of this is a town that's not developed yet for this map.
That's fine. Plenty of people have that going on.
No, I think it's like such a a common DM thing that isn't, you don't want to admit to not being prepared. But there's a degree of rolling with the punches and being flexible and having fun with it. And so I like to give myself a blank canvas in that way. So this isn't even a definitive, like my maps, I never say that they're definitive. There are towns that get added as we play. A good example of that is up on the north end there, I have a town called Cider Hall. And Cider Hall is just a small, like a tiny town of halflings, because we ran into a group of traveling halflings, and they said, "Where are you from?" And I thought I could put them at one of the towns that are sort of on the way, but then they'll go there, and these people will interact with them again, and I'd rather not do that to us yet. I don't want to paint us into a corner, and so I wrote a new town in and made it a little town that's an apple orchard town, just kind of on the spot. And then I had to go back and remake this map, not the whole thing, just throw that one in there. And,
right.
And I think there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I've done that plenty of times. Yeah, let's talk about the gods for your world next. What are those like?
Yeah, that's like I said, I start with the general D&D pantheon, and I even say, if there's something specific from outside of D&D that you want to bring in to my players, whatever you want to bring in, let me know. We can talk it through it. And I've never had somebody bring something where I said no straight out.
Mhm.
I think the closest I've gotten to that was one of my players wanted to play a dog, like just not an awoken dog, not a magic transformed dog, like just a dog. Um, and
There,
yeah,
there is a role playing system for playing a
yeah,
pack of dogs.
yeah. We ended up not even a pack. We ended up making her character a dog, and we gave her dog the ability to speak, and then kind of developed a rogue class, around that dog.
Okay, the dog archetype.
Yeah, the dog rogue, and just sort of each level custom set something up. But that's the closest I've ever gotten to saying no outright to something. But it ended up being really fun. For this one, I said to my players, what do you want to use as your god, or if you're from a town that you might not worship the god, but the rest of the town does, what god would that be? And then I sort of stacked the deck around that. Um, so there are 3 sections to our pantheon. Like I said, each one is made up of 5 gods. So the primarily good gods are called the 5. Very straightforward. They're Tyr, who is in a lot of D&D, but I think is actually a Norse god. I might be wrong about that.
Yeah, yeah. Tyr is a giant within the Asgardian.
Okay, cool. Every now and then I'm like, I'm making that up. I don't know. But yeah, Tyr, who is one of our players' uh, characters' gods. Um, Rilithane Ralathil, an elvish god. Of course, we have Bahamut. I love a good dragon god. We have Moradin, who's our dwarf god, the lawful good god of dwarves. And then Yondella, who is a halfling matriarch and creator. And I don't know that is always used as a god, but in our context, I thought it worked. And then we have the sort of neutral gods. They're called the fair. Again, there's 5 of them. We have Tamora, who's the goddess of good luck. Iedro, who's a merfolk, kind of god of the sea. Savris, who is the wizards, divination, fate, that kind of stuff. And it might be Savris. That one has become huge. One of our players is a divination wizard. And I'll come back to this a little bit, but that I really didn't think was going to be such a big part of our campaign, and has really, really started to be the centerpiece. We have Ogma, who's a patron of bards, and Scorius Stonebones, who's the giant god of craftsmen.
I thought Ogma was like the god of the earth.
I think that Ogma might be a couple things. I think that's a very D&D problem to run into. Is that first to 3.5 to 5e. The version of Ogma that we're running with is the greater god of inspiration, invention, knowledge, and the patron of bards.
Okay.
But maybe it's reuse of names. Maybe it's the same character evolving. I'm happy to be
No,
corrected.
that's got to be something different.
If you get an angry email from somebody, let me know, because I don't want to be I don't want to be too wrong.
No, I was thinking of Ogremok.
Oh, okay.
The one I was thinking
Yeah.
of. A lot of similar syllables there.
Yeah, that's that. Hey, there you go. I try to do single syllable, and that ends up getting repetitive real quick. And then we have also the fallen, who are generally stereotypically evil gods. Again, there are 5 of them, but in our world, we've only revealed a couple. They are sort of forgotten gods in the world. So the ones that my players know about are Cyric, who's the god of lies, trickery, and strife. They recently found out that included in this category is Tiamat.
Okay. Bahamut, you got to have Tiamat.
Yep, you got to have Tiamat. And that one is, again, kind of becoming a more active part, because there are sort of a new wave of worshippers of Tiamat showing up. And they're sort of vying for we're not as bad as you think. And so there's sort of this Tiamat reformation going on in our world, and that's very fun to see. And the rest of the Fallen are not revealed yet, and so that gives me, again, a little bit of room to play. I know who those ones are, actually, because to me that's kind of a big puzzle piece. But currently they're still hidden, still forgotten in the world.
Anything else you want to say on the gods besides just sort of a quick list of them?
Yeah, I think like I was talking about, Savris, I think, is one that I touched on briefly. Savris is the sort of fate divination space, and that kind of connected me to the theme of our campaign, which I tend to kind of work outwardly from theme. So with the previous campaign that I DM'd, I started out very general, and once we knew who our big bad was, it was a shapeshifter character. And then our campaign really quickly became about identity. And this shapeshifter character who takes over identities in the literal sense, also this character who had existed for so long that they'd basically kind of forgotten who they were and why they were doing what they were doing. and then the identity of the player characters, and that sort of became our driving theme, and that ended up developing a lot of what those towns and worlds were about. This campaign in Oryn has sort of fallen into being about fate and faith, and Savras being this divination god has made it, a little bit more of a guiding light. Our divination wizard, who's a turtle, she is playing like an old lady turtle, which is just hysterical. She does a phenomenal old lady voice at the table, and I wish I could do it for you, but it wouldn't do it justice. And she pulls actual tarot cards during the game, so she has a deck of tarot cards with her, and
Oh, that's great.
she's learning that as we go, because it's specific for this character. It's not a thing that she did in her life before. And so she has a little book and she goes through. So if she's making a decision, if she's meeting a new character and trying to get a read on them, she will, she'll roll perception checks like normal, but then she'll pull cards also. And I cannot even begin to tell you how accurate her pulls have been. It is the creepiest thing. Every time I have like some sort of plan that they don't know about, or some character who they shouldn't trust, she pulls a card. It's always like, don't trust that person. I'm like, how are you doing that? It's dark magic. I mean, it has to be, right? Like it is amazing. And we keep record of them. So I have a whole list of the cards she's pulled and what they were about, and prophecies basically that she's made by pulling cards, by nature of rolling. And then if it's not something that's decided yet, we'll work it in. And so in that way, Savras and fate have become a big part of this campaign, and like what's decided and what isn't has become sort of a really, they haven't played out a lot of those things yet, but they did just have sort of precognizant dreams for each of them. And so those are benchmarks of, does that have to happen, or is that something that you can influence?
Power of cold reading also.
Yeah, exactly. God, those cards are, I mean, it's so fun to get to play with that.
Well, we talked a little bit before about the different places that races have in your campaign. So if you have such this big focus on mind flayers, I'm curious if the Gith have a big role.
Not yet. That's a really good question. In the world of this campaign, the mind flayer is sort of otherworldly. Where the mind flayer came from is, cause of speculation throughout. And so that hasn't really played out the mind flayer's actual background and lore yet. But there's a lot of room to explore that. And that's one of the reasons that I really like to have a section of the map that's unexplored, a second continent that's sort of developing as you use your first, not a complete world map from the get-go. Like I was saying, the pre-session planning should really, or not pre-session, but game planning should really only go so far. You want to give yourself space to grow. And so in that way, I haven't gotten around to them yet.
Okay. What about the rest of the races? We talked a little bit about elves and a little bit about dwarves, but we also got humans, halflings, and whatever other base races you got there.
We have the standard D&D spread. We've got tieflings in there. We've got dwarves and halflings and gnomes, and we also have turtles, like I mentioned. We have owlin, who are a part of the world. We've run into, wow, I'm blanking on what they're called, which is so embarrassing, but the elephant people.
Loxodon.
Loxodons, yeah. We ran into one Loxodon. Standard D&D monstrous races, but as far as our world goes, that's something that I like to keep very flexible. Again, which is just going to sound like me saying the same thing over and over again, which is, true. I like to leave that very open melting pot kind of world. As far as like geography goes, we have sort of a source area for elves, an area for dwarves, sort of where the dwarven capital is, and then the sort of human general capital. I don't really like to say that it's like a human town. I think that's sort of like the capital of the world. We have a town where all the owl and owlin come from. We have a town where the portal folk come from. And so we have some specific landmarks, and then some sort of, races have ended up here over time, and where their home of origin might be off map, might be so long ago that it's essentially forgotten. Those things, again, room to grow into as we go.
Gotcha. I guess this goes back to a different question I had before. Is like, how big is your world? Like, is Oryn the size of like Europe, or?
Yeah, I heard you ask that on another episode, and it was so funny because it was not something I'd really put into words with this one. I did with my last session, really kind of scope it out in size, and this one I just sort of grew as I was planning and didn't backtrack from it. And I heard someone kind of compare their map to the US. That is massive. I mean, when you really when you really think about how big the United States is as a map, I mean, that is a huge landmass.
Right.
Um, I tend to think of this map as, lengthwise half of the US, maybe. You could cross it in, a couple weeks of direct travel. Um, but it has these sort of restrictive pathways. You have to, if you're crossing by land, there's only one bridge that connects two of these land masses in a couple places. You could go by ship, but you have to go all the way around. And that's why I sort of choose these sort of reaching out shapes, these sort of cut in bays and things like that to sort of
Hmm.
limit the pathways
Okay.
so that as far as scope and scale goes, even if it's not the physically largest thing, you can't really make a straight line across this map. Um, but yeah, maybe about half the size of the U.S., the continental U.S.
Okay. Gotcha. Oh man, yeah, there was that person that was asking about the different types of food that you have in your campaign
Yeah,
build.
I wrote down a couple questions from the Discord. So that there was one specific question about, I'm gonna scroll down to it here. What's the best cheese in your world?
Yes.
I love that. That came from Sage. Such a good specific question. And for me, like little details like that are kind of I work backwards out of those. So if I'm like, oh, I want a new cheese, I'll make a town around that cheese. But for this, I thought, I'll build with what I have here already. So specifically for cheese, I would say there's two answers, and just like the real world, I think there's two towns that would probably fight you over their town having the best cheese. I think
Of
that's
course.
that's you got the best hot dogs in the U.S. Who's going to fight you for that? Best pizza, best cheese. So New Lernea, like we talked about, is sort of the elven capital. I think they would have some sort of like fancy high-end cheese that has to be like properly aged in a special cheese cellar. It'd be like very fancy cheese. They would probably say that's the best. And then that little sort of merchant town of Costco that I talked about, I think they would have like a greasy, like American mixed cheese kind of deal. It's just like a bunch of cheeses melted together that
Uh-huh.
that come on some sort of street meat, and a lot of people would say that's the best. And so I guess that's a matter of opinion what best cheese means to you.
Good answer.
And Stage also asked where you would go to learn to conjure that cheese. And I mentioned the Academy Arcana, the Magic Academy in Nolmeth is sort of our center of magic learning. So I think that'd probably be a pretty safe bet.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, we you were talking about food in general too. We
Yeah.
food has been like one of those things I did not plan for. I always have a couple little fruits or foods that are fantasy oriented that I like to play with. But food has become really central to this campaign because our Nacho Libre inspired character, he is looking for ingredients all the time. He's trying to find things to bring home to make new recipes for the orphans. And
Okay.
yeah, it's hilarious, and it really makes me think about like everything we interact with. He's very careful about asking, if we kill a monster, can I cut a piece off of this and try to cook it? and if we go to a new town, what sort of unique ingredients do they have? And it's really led to a new line of thinking for me. That town of Spember that I mentioned having in all of my campaigns has a consistent export called ham fruit, and it is sort of a pink fruit with a curly Q stem. Looks kind of like a pig, just no face. And that's sort of a fantasy joke in all of my campaigns. Just this little sweet ham fruit thing because it's hallucinogenic if you eat it raw, and if you cook it into a pie or something like that, it'll get you kind of drunk. And so you have to like learn the special way to cook it. And I like to have these little details that they can play with. My players are convinced that there is a conspiracy around ham fruit as this sort of illegal piece of produce, and so now I've bit into that. So now there is something for them to explore there. Whether or not it's a real
Cool.
conspiracy remains to be seen for them, but there's outlets for that if they want to explore it more. But yeah, every town now has to have a signature dish and stuff that they can, ingredients they can learn about because one of our players is interested in that, and it adds so much character to each town and world when you really like dig into what they eat, what their crop export is, stuff like that. The sort of like basic boring stuff in your life ends up being such a good tool in a campaign like this. And I always do like a warm up question pre-session, usually about a week ahead if I can. I shouldn't say always, I forget a lot, but I try to. And this week's was what's something that your characters miss about home while you're on these journeys. And of
Oh,
course,
that's a good one.
yeah, it's really fun because it creates a memory, right? And a sense memory even. And food is obviously a big part of that answer for a lot of characters. And so that's a fun thing to get to explore is. And then I write it down, and if we ever go to their hometown, that food is there waiting, you know?
That's cool. I've actually not related to D&D, but I've had like questions like that when I'm doing like a staff meeting at work to
Yeah.
break the ice.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, it's like an icebreaker question is a perfect character warm-up question, right? Because it makes you
Yeah.
think about the past of your character, which is a thing you might not normally get to explore except in dialogue or in consequence. And so instead for it to just be, who's somebody from home or you haven't got to talk to in a while, I encourage my players to like write letters to people, and that either creates or revisits a character, creates a line of communication, and sometimes can lead to a side quest or a resource or a thing that they didn't have before that now is part of the world.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, are there any of these other locations that you want to talk more about? Maybe Costco, because you seemed into that
Yeah.
before.
Costco is so funny to me. It's just Costco. Like that's the joke, right? It's so
Yeah.
obvious, but I love to have a merchant based town. The idea of a shopping episode, I think, is really a common D&D trope, where you get into a new big town. My session is actually going into the capital town next, so I've been prepping that pretty heavily right now. And it's sort of that nightmare scenario for D&D of like, essentially, you get to this town and it's the largest town in the nation. Anything that you are looking to buy or find is probably going to exist here. So Costco
Yes.
is basically that way as well. It's a big merchant town where you could find a very specific kind of vendor or thing. We haven't actually gone there in the campaign yet, but that one is one that I love the idea of this constantly moving merchant town. There's always hustle and bustle and a busy street food market and bigger stores that are established there. And any town like that is going to have a shady side too. And that's where the real fun starts, right? Is the under the table Costco deals.
Yes.
But yeah, as far as like other specific towns, I mean, I could any number of these we could run through. But I love Sima Nublar is such a fun, the dinosaur aspect of that is so fun. Sansitlan has the excuse my pronunciation, but the Pueblo de los Muertos on the south coast. There is a town of the dead,
Hmm.
and they have a specific relationship with sort of ghost spirit entities who are still on their plane, because of their relationship with the goddess of death there. And so that's kind of a fun aspect that we haven't played in narrative yet, but one of our characters has started to touch on a bit.
Okay.
We have a couple sites of war. We have the Ironwood, which is a forest having grown over a battlefield, and then we have the fields of Farron, which is again a battlefield that has basically remained untouched. So you have sort of war scars on this continent, which is a fun thing to get to play with as well. I have Keaton, or sorry, Cafe and Anjou. That is a Majora's Mask reference. It's two. I like to do two warring towns,
Uh-huh.
and warring is usually kind of silly. It's a rivalry of some kind that's derived from some sort of misunderstanding or a traditional D&D joke is two towns that are sort of rivals. And I like those names from Majora's Mask. They're the two. I said Keaton
Yeah.
because the mask you get from it is the Keaton mask, but the two, characters who are in love with each other and one of them has been turned into a kid and all
Oh,
this.
that's right. Okay,
Yeah.
I was thinking like, what place is called that in
I know
Majora's Mask?
it's I like to take a character name, use it as a place so that you're not thinking of it right away. It's a little
Yeah.
subtle, but it's not as direct the reason for that. It's just a little name reference.
Okay,
Um,
gotcha.
Yeah, and then I like to have a couple options of sort of standard towns that when you arrive at them are a little bit wild. So we had Bromwich, which is on the northern area. So it was a snowy winter time when we got there, and one of the characters had spent some time there before in their history, but not in our gameplay. And so he and I talked about the expectations of what that town was like and who he would know and who he would look for when he gets there. And then when they got there, the town was overrun by the Fey realm. That essentially this sort of portal between the two had opened and a bunch of Fey entities were like throwing a party in this town and sort of tearing it up. And
Of
so
course.
his expectations of that town were sort of turned upside down. And so, one of the characters he was looking for was still around, but the rest of the town was sort of for him a surprise. And that was a really fun way to kind of, oh yeah, hey, tell me about what you think is going to be in this town and let's talk it through. And then none of that mattered. You really just turn their expectations around. And then when they clear this area of this party and give them the boot, then the town kind of goes back to normal, and those expectations matter for the future, which is very fun.
Yeah, that's cool. So in your survey, you mentioned like you had like some kind of mechanic for each of the different worlds that you came up with. What was the one for Oryn?
Yeah, so I develop a mechanic around the sort of homebrew, generally that takes shape as we go.
Hmm.
This one I haven't really dug into a specific mechanic outside of that tarot and fate kind of stuff. And that again, it sort of lines up with the themes that we play with. We have now sort of a table running for this of all of these tarot card pulls, and then also just regular um, predictions and prophecies that come to pass. And so they've, in a couple forms, they've now seen prophecies written down or spoken that could or could not come to pass. And I play with those as mechanics now about, as simple as a coin toss, as simple as a a roll of the dice to see whether or not something is going to happen, or you put the choice to the player. You let them see the outcome of something 10 sessions ahead of time, and then bring that choice up. And if they remember from their notes, great. And if they don't, you can tell them about it after. And you see what choice they take. And so I like to give really simple visual reminders for that from a memory or from a prediction.
Okay.
Also mechanically in this one, I like to play with memory. We talked a little bit about memory with the false hydra. But in our last session, a player had a memory taken from him in a bet, and that kind of thing. It's really fun to play that consequence out, if it feels appropriate. But also, you let them choose. You let them come up with a memory that then they, as a player, have, but the character doesn't. Is such a fun way to get them to develop what their character's stakes are, as you go. That particular memory, I don't know if it will come in as a consequence, but the sort of player action of it was really fun to play at the table.
Cool. Cool. Did you want to say anything more about your campaign world before we got into like the events of the campaign you've been playing in it?
Yeah, I think we kind of covered the stuff that I wanted to talk about specifically. I mean, I have stuff about the other worlds that I've played in that are fun, but I don't think that that's really super relevant. I don't want to bog down people with a bunch of different things. Yeah, prophecy is a big one. Legends and things like that kind of come into play. Uh, yeah, no, I think we've covered most of the world. I'm happy to answer questions about specific places too. I mean, look, I have a couple questions for my players as well that maybe I can talk about. We talked about food a bit. One of my players who's playing the monk is sort of quite wondering how much thought goes into the food, so we talked about that for a bit.
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah,
had a different question. Like you seem
sure.
to have a lot of focus on like emotional plot devices. Like in your survey, you mentioned using like time travel to hit emotional points for players. So do you want to talk a little bit more about how your writing process goes for bringing those moments in?
Yeah, I think for me that's the centerpiece of any campaign, right? Is your players feeling emotionally invested, and that can be really difficult to do. It's also really easy to do. You do the John Wick, you kill somebody's dog, and it's on. There are hooks that you can throw in. But I like to use memory for that specifically, and without prompting, we've talked about memory a couple times now, which is perfect. Um, and I think it's an underutilized tool to create memory throughout the campaign. I think sometimes you think about your players' character creation as sort of this one and done part of the process. They do it at the beginning, and then everything that happens after during the campaign is all that matters as far as character development. But it can be really fun to get them to revisit their past as a character while you're playing. To say, hey, who's a person who you remember from your hometown as a warm up exercise? Or if you're going to that town, delving into it more and pulling out little memories and things. I have in the past, but not for this session quite yet, done solo sessions throughout the campaign. So I'll pull a character aside and say, hey, I want to play out a memory with you because it feels very core to your character, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page about how it happened. So in my last campaign, our warlock, we played out the memory of her meeting her patron, and we played through that little deal that they made. And that becomes a very core part of how the rest of their character plays. And whether or not the rest of the group gets to hear that, it really does end up influencing the way they play. As far as like
Hmm.
memory in the world, I think it's very fun to play with it as like a tradable tool. Something that someone can take from you or give to you. Is I try not to do it too much because you want it to feel major when it happens.
Right.
But it can be very fun to kind of play with that because it's a fantasy space, and that doesn't prevent metagaming. It almost encourages a little bit of meta thought in your character. But the idea of I know something about my character that they don't know, and it's really fun to catch a player in that for them to say, "Oh, I know this because of this," and then they say, "Oh no, my character doesn't know that anymore." When you give them that exact benchmark, it's really easy for them to
Uh,
catch themselves in that, and that's a very fun moment of realization for a character. I've played with that a lot in my last campaign. This campaign, I haven't started to dig into that too much, but memory has become a big part of it. Memory and prophecy in this one, really. Which again, just like the two parts of fate, what's already happened to you, did that have to happen? And what's going to happen next, does that have to happen the way that it's been seen? Which is very fun.
yeah, I put in my notes that in some cases it sounded like you're almost creating this like It's a Wonderful Life
Yeah, that's
like plot.
yeah. I try not to um make it feel silly when you're talking about memory, unless it's specifically like, and I'm not that It's a Wonderful Life is silly, but like, if you're doing too heavy of a reference to something like that, it can start to feel a little bit silly. Um,
Yes.
I try not to make it feel campy with memory. But when you step into that too much, you definitely can. But when you talk about like a character's childhood, or a common one for D&D is a mentor character. So one of our players, he and I sort of developed his mentor character because it's likely that that character will show up again, or he will reach out to that character. And when you
Hmm.
talk about what do you remember about that person, and what do you expect them to be like, that kind of prep is really important to me because you don't want to show up and play across from somebody and they're realizing, oh, this isn't how this character, especially for someone who does a lot of prep work for their character.
Right.
They've imagined something, and so you want to get that character in line with them. And as a DM, you're playing that character, right, as you play across from them. And so, when you're building someone they're very familiar with, the more memories they have of them, the better. And so to communicate those memories, very straightforward. What do you remember? And then I'll play back and forth. Here's something that they remember about you, or here's a memory you share with them, and those sort of create connecting factors, um, which is such a useful tool.
Yeah, that really is cementing it more as like a storytelling game instead of rolling dice game for how you're structuring your settings.
It's sort of the embarrassingly obvious I work in film tell, right? Where it's like it's that's how I've always viewed D&D, as like you're playing a movie. I'm not a super numbers focused DM, but I do play by the rules. I love the rule of cool. I think it's great to get to play that every now and then, but I don't like lean only on it. I think you do need to succeed in your rules unless you have a real reason for something to work, even if you fail, or whatever the thing is.
Hmm.
I play that very case by case, but when you look at Guardians of the Galaxy, I mean, I won't spoil the new movie, it's too soon, but the Guardians of the Galaxy movies are a D&D campaign, like
Yes.
hands down. That's a D&D, that's a found family story in a magical space setting. That's a D&D campaign. And like when you get to play with those kinds of elements, they're the individual's character's past coming back to haunt them. I'll reference two since that's been out long enough, but
Yeah.
Star
Yeah.
Lord's father figure in the first one being established as not around, and then that's the consequence of the second movie, is that he is trying to find you or whatever, and he's this otherworldly god character. That's a D&D story. And so you establish these little pieces that you can pull on when they become relevant, and when the group cares enough about each other and their characters to invest in that. And if your father character comes back in the first movie and they're all in the prison together again, sorry, Guardians of the Galaxy, like you're not going to care, you're not going to go help them. And so to get them invested enough to pull on those memory based threads, those backstory based threads, like that's the core of a D&D campaign to me, is for everybody to be invested in each other's characters enough to
Yeah.
to act on
It's
all that.
it's kind of funny that you're mentioning all of that, and then I'm thinking of like the original like Lord of the Rings that inspired D&D, where those kind of connections aren't really that present for a lot of the characters.
No, no. I mean, that's so high fantasy, right? And like that, I think that there's an additional part of that that still plays true, which is this like world exploration as a reader. So if you're
Hmm.
reading The Hobbit and you're exploring these new worlds with him, because he's an explorer in that moment, right? He's going to a new place he's never been, and it's that sort of wonder. And I know it's sort of a silly connection, but it reminds me of like the food descriptions in Redwall, where it's like
Uh,
I could sit here for an hour and read a description of a banquet because it's so amazing sounding, and that's the high fantasy Lord of the Rings to me, of like, you're just, wow, the elven towns seem so amazing and so interesting. I want to sit in them and sit over this waterfall and look at all these people and look at what's going on here. And when you're developing a new place in a D&D campaign, it's so important to have that vibe and that aesthetic and that feeling to a place. And that's something that I actually have to really actively remind myself I'm not very good at this. When you are introducing a new space, to say, hey, stop for a second, stop the action, and describe the space around them in like vivid and encapsulating detail. So if they want to ask questions about it, they want to explore it more. And I think that's sort of Lord of the Rings of it, because otherwise you get, I mean, I know this is a movie specific reference, but that idea of like, Legolas doesn't know Frodo and Frodo doesn't know Legolas's name. Have you seen this
Right.
joke? That like
Yeah,
at the end of Lord of the Rings, Frodo just looks at Legolas and smiles because he doesn't know he doesn't know his name.
because they've never talked to each other in
They've
the
never
movies.
talked the whole movies, and I don't know. I haven't read all of the books, which is just like my big nerd shame. But like that idea, I don't know if it's true in the books, but in the movies, it's like you don't want to get to that point of your campaign of these two characters who are so important. Unless you do, if that's the joke, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with throwing in a little gag of like, oh, did we just meet? It's like, dude, I've been here the whole time. That can
And
be very fun.
yeah, they don't talk to each other much in the books, but I think there is a scene where Legolas is the one that makes sure that Frodo is okay after he gets stabbed by the troll in the Fellowship.
I feel like that moment might even happen in the movies. Like he, leans down and checks on him, but the idea, that joke being 10 years late, is so funny to me that like came
Yeah,
around the internet so far
yeah,
after.
yeah.
But yeah, that's that part of, building the world, um, based on backstory. So like I said, I have this, large spread of towns here, and some of them are sort of fantasy stereotypes. Some of them are, um, worlds and towns that I like to incorporate because they're fun. And then some of them are player created, and then the player created ones really end up spreading throughout my world very quickly. Is like that becomes the centerpiece of our campaign. Why those towns exist, why you would leave them and explore the rest of the world, what has drawn you out of that place, and that becomes way more important to me than, um, writing my fantasy novel. I'll do that on
Mm.
my own time. That's a different world. I'm not doing that. Nobody look for a book written by me. Don't read it.
All right, cool, cool. Your campaign that's going on right now,
Mhm.
you mentioned that the players had focused on trying to dive more into the defeated Mind Flayer Empire. Let's talk about that.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm gonna give my players a warning here. This is where they should stop listening, because I want to give a little more context, and I think it would be a little bit of spoiler territory, for them. So here's your jumping out point. Get out of here.
Okay. Yeah,
Go.
there it is.
Yeah, you did it. Great job. Click to the end of the episode so it counts as a full listen, and then get out of here.
So they don't have to do that. It's like 5 minutes.
Okay,
So
good. Yeah,
they're already
I
there.
want to make sure you get that Spotify view. Um, yeah. So we had that sort of as a historical precedent. I sent at the beginning of the campaign, because this is a group of, internet strangers. We all kind of gather online and we play in
Mhm.
person, which is just an absolute blessing after doing a 2-year online campaign, which I loved doing. The resources online again are very fun to get to use all those maps and things, but to be able to play in person with minis and all of that is like, that's just what that feeling of D&D classic.
Right.
And so we're playing in person, and that sort of pre-game 2-paragraph thing had the history of the war and who the current king is, and a picture of the map and the towns that they came from, and that was about it. It was pretty straightforward. So the war 100 years ago, this mind flayer shows up kind of out of the blue. Historically, they haven't established where it came from, um, and sort of starts this war of territory, taking over mines with these, mind slugs, essentially these sort of face hugger esque creatures that, plant on top of a person's head and sort of cover their eyes and have little tentacles over their mouth, very
Okay.
zombie style,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and spread out throughout the continent. And so that war lasted about 100 years. When they finally won, there's this moment where the king at the time, who sort of united the people to fight against this onslaught, uh, was sealed in sort of a shield bubble, by his mages, to have one-on-one combat with the head mind flayer, this lead mind flayer. So what actually happens in there is obscured from most people. And then after that combat happens, all of the possessed, overtaken, we call them mind slaves. Once those all die in that moment, and the bubble goes away, and the king is left standing, and this mind flayer is dead. Our players have been venturing in the north 100 years after that happened, and they come to a town. We did a really fun murder mystery because I like to sort of throw a, a non-mechanical episode at people, So that was a very
Right.
clue-oriented session, which is very fun and sort of takes you out of how am I going to hit this person, or what's the what spell do I use, and you still use spells to investigate and whatnot.
Right.
But then the following session, they were trying to undo uh, the call that they had made because they said they had basically accused the wrong person of this murder. And then in
Okay.
exploring that town, they find a cave, and in that cave is a small prison cell where a mind slave is still living. And so
Oh,
this
okay.
this person, the human body being long dead, but that's unclear through these cell doors, is trying to convince them to let it out. And they talk to it for a little while. And I mean, it is the most. We're talking about Guardians of the Galaxy. This could not be more like a Marvel joke feeling moment. One of our players had seen the password to unseal this magical prison um, earlier and said to the creature in the cell out loud, "Does this word mean anything to you?" And then the door unlocks. And, and like a zombie, this thing realizes that it can get out and rushes out at them. And one of our players uses a spear and, thought very quickly and said, I'm gonna stab it. And he sort of gets pushed back by the force of this thing scrambling out, but does stab it, and it gets its head just out of the sort of line of magic, this
Mhm.
barrier that is preventing it from connecting to the sort of mind flayer network that they all, are part of through this, connection.
Okay.
And as it gets out, it connects to that network again and laughs at them, and then kills itself. Because what's the point? Like, the network is still out there. I needed to make sure that I'm not the last one. Done. And so they have no direct experience knowledge that this big threat is probably still out there in some form. And the next thing they're doing is taking this mind slug by itself, disconnected from the corpse it was piloting, to the capital to say, "Hey, look, this threat is still out there." And so we'll see where that plays out for them. But the again, big spoilers. If they've listened to this point, they've heard that stuff. But now you gotta go. You gotta go. Um, they they'll find out throughout this that, of course, that mind flayer is still around. It was severely weakened, and so it was
Mhm.
sort of playing the underground long game. And its power is coming back. It's sort of started to overtake pockets of the world again, but it has evolved a bit. So the mind flayer itself is a big brain in a tank. It's not on a human-esque body anymore. And the
Okay.
things it uses to control people are no longer these face hugger things. They're little slugs that go up into your nose and melt your brain and stay in and pilot your head. And so they just had an encounter with one of these new age kind of overtaken people.
Yeah, it's something just like that in Star Trek.
Yeah, it does have that sort of it's not the Borg, but it's sort of, become one vibe. And I love to play with this sort of zombie space. Um Not always traditional zombies, although I do that. I have done like a zombie session, somebody summoning zombies to attack a town.
Mhm.
But there's something to, especially for your first big bad, your first villain with a group of new players who you haven't played with before. There's something really freeing about a villain who is just evil, and enemies who you're fighting who are, for all intents and purposes, already dead. And so you don't have to worry about the ethics of fighting this thing, because whatever you're doing to stop that thing is a good thing. And then you can play with the moral gray area of their character more rather than the plot. And then,
Right.
that once that plot line is played out, we've set the stage for a bunch of other plot lines with other big bads. Like I mentioned, there's a new cult of Tiamat showing up, and that's one that I'm really excited about getting to kind of play with, because they've had exclusively bad interactions with the Bahamut followers, just sort of by chance. That was not something I planted. And then, the Tiamat followers have been very helpful to them. Well, mostly, some of them not so much, but a few of them have been very helpful to them. And so there's sort of this, are these all bad people kind of feeling? And then once we get to that really taking off, I think it will be a little more clear. But yeah, this Mind Flayer one is really a fun starting point for them.
Yeah, that sounds really intriguing for the players. So I'm hoping that goes well for them.
Yeah, and we talked a bit about, a ton now about memory. And the memory aspect of this will become the memory of the land because they will explore the history. And they haven't gotten to this point yet, but they will have an item, a magical item that allows them to witness the past. And so then those sort of battlefields from the past become very important because you can go there and see where that final fight happened, or you can go to the place where the Mind Flayer initially landed, where it came from, and witness those moments happen. And so again, they have historical knowledge from the world that others don't have. That sort of it gives them clues as to where to look next or who might be involved and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really cool stuff.
Yeah, we're still moderately early in the campaign. I think this next one is like our 8th or 9th session. And so we really, took off with that. That little cave moment that I was talking about, with the mind slave, that they found wasn't really supposed to kick off the big bad. It was one of many hooks that were out there for them to grab onto, but they really bit into it and seemed very interested in it. And so I said, okay, well, this will be it. So then the next session was really leaning towards that. And our next one will be the sort of kickoff point for the big stuff, which is always very fun to get into.
Cool. Are you going to bring in any other the like classic Mind Flayer monsters? I guess is one question I'd have.
Yeah, like I said, this is the first session in a while that I've played in person, and so I did like an Etsy kick where I just rolled through Etsy and looked at the coolest Mind Flayer style minis that are out there.
Oh, okay.
And that is a fun afternoon. It is bad for your wallet, and I haven't ordered all of them yet because I want to get a little closer to that actually happening. You don't want to overinvest. But I found some very fun stuff on there that I'm really excited to bring in. Some old school Mind Flayer, not sidekicks, but variations that are monsters that, in my mind, for our world, will be things that this Mind Flayer has sort of made and developed while it's hiding and regaining power. And then also, some of these sort of weirder takes on Mind Flayers that people have come up with now, like Titan Mind Flayers, just like big, gigantic creatures overtaken by this thing. I think there's so much fun space to play there.
Ooh, that's cool.
Yeah, and especially with the advent of 3D printers. I mean, just the variation of things that you can get. And there's no reason not to just say, okay, yeah, well, this guy, he's got a big creature guarding his door. Why wouldn't it also be a Mind Flayer giant or a Mind Flayer, of some strange otherworldly creature? And so those are very fun to play with. I don't have specific like generals for this guy quite yet. I think that's kind of the territory I'll go into, is like mini boss style tiers to get into.
Yeah, there was the 3rd edition template you could apply to monsters, which was the pseudo-natural template, which wasn't quite Mind Flayers. It was like Far Realm stuff, but still like kind of the same thing where, you slap that template onto a monster and now it has tentacles and can do weird Mind Flayer stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like you give them just that little bit of visual connectivity, right? And then also you have now the sort of like space fantasy version of Mind Flayers and all of that from Spelljammer, and having this Mind Flayer not be of this world. It's really fun to get to play the sort of standard other plane, or is it a space monster, and sort of give that room to explore for the players of trying to figure out where it came from and how helpful that is to them. They get to decide, like, if we can figure out where it came from, will it give us an advantage? Or if we figure out its past, what would we know how to kill it? Those kinds of things. Let them choose how much of that detail they need. Or if they're like, let's go kill it right now, good luck, I guess. It's usually the spin.
Oh, that reminds me, in 4th edition, they had this dungeon in the Dungeon Master's Guide 2. They had this thing called themes, where there was a bunch of different themes for like different cults that you could apply an ability on a monster, and they all had some sort of like defining theme, obviously. So you could have stuff that went together, and you could like put this ability on this monster and this on this one, and they all felt like mechanically identical.
Yeah, like a kit bashed background for a monster.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, I think especially with I don't know how much 4E really over, because I played 3.5 for a while.
Hmm. Yeah.
I never really played 4. I don't think I've definitely never DM'd for 4. I don't think I've ever played in a session for 4E. But you know how much that overlapped with the internet homebrew kind of world. But now with the accessibility of homebrew and all that, so many times I will like look at a stat block for a monster either in a published book or in a, Unearthed Arcana kind of
Right.
session, and you're looking at that like, yeah, this works, but it doesn't hit all the marks that I want, or it's not quite as difficult or connected to the terrain as I want. I don't think there's anything wrong with stealing an ability from another monster to make it feel more directly connected to the session at hand.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
the shapeshifter big bad from my last campaign that I talked about had, essentially like time powers, and I justified those through this character having been around a long time and sort of grabbing onto different magical artifacts and rituals and things like that.
Right.
Um, and there's nothing wrong with giving them a new power set to make them more interesting, the same way that your players find magical items or find new abilities or multi-class. That's an established mechanic. Just play around with it. And I've never had a player be like, what class was that monster? Or like, tell me more about the
Yeah.
details of this thing, because once it's played, it's played. And also, if you have a metagamey player, that's a great way to mess with their heads. I mean, if you have somebody who's like, yeah, I've played Strahd a bunch of times, I know what Strahd can do. It's like, okay, well, now Strahd can turn into a dragon. So Strahd's a vampire. He's been around for a million years. Like, let him learn something new. Um, Obviously, that's not canon Strahd, but you know what I mean.
Right. Right. Right.
The idea of mixing these villains up in a way that makes them feel unique and new and fresh for even for a player who's been playing for a long time. And if you're saying I'm playing by the module, then play by the module. Don't lie to your players. But if you're doing a homebrew world, things are going to feel homebrew. I have this, so there's a million tools for a DM to have your
Right.
indexes and things like that, but I just make it in Google Docs and Google Sheets. I make a custom thing for every campaign I do. Yeah, I had a pretty wild like session of dreams last session. They all had their different dreams that sort of revealed a path, a possible history or future. So, as we're moving forward in the campaign, I like to give them something that they can look forward to that feels like a big moment, and whether or not that plays with the current big bad, with the current, focus. They can, play towards whatever our end game is, or they're just general enough that if this group is going to fall apart pretty soon, or whatever the fate of this group is through scheduling. Every DM knows the nightmare of I'm not going to get to finish my campaign because of that. I like to give myself tools to throw in a session. Say, hey, if we're not gonna do this, if this isn't gonna continue forever, let's do one more, let's do two more at least, and just really knock these out. And then you have some little tools to play with. So I gave a session at the end of the session. I gave dreams, and so these will play out over time. But our Owlin had a dream about a giant barn owl staring down at him, and he's a druid, so it'll sort of go into the basis of his powers a little bit. One of our players had a direct vision from Tyr, his god, and it sort of directly clashed with he's sort of revenge driven as a character. And so I had his god speak to him and tell him patience. I wanted him to have sort of, the angel and devil on his shoulder. Go for vengeance, go for like be patient, wait for the right moment, kind of give him both. To think about. One of our characters had a dream directly about the Mind Flayer, our Nacho Libre character, which again, you have sort of a comical background of a character. It's very fun to take that and turn it on its head and make them the most scared, the most driven to deal with this villain. So he had a dream about the orphanage that he usually works at and it's like his family. There's all these kids there that he is in charge of, and there's other adults who are taking care of it while he's gone. And he sees all these people in his dream overtaken with tentacles and inhuman features. And so then there's this horror, right? This like, I have to save the world or this will happen. Right. And then a sort of further down the line one, our sorcerer got his wild magic sorcerer, got his power through a bet through the same character who later steals another character's memory, a sort of wandering god character. And his, sorcerer's powers can come from a lot of things, but one of the main ones is bloodline. And so for someone to be given wild magic sorcery powers in a bet, I wanted to play with, well, it's not just that you get powers like a genie wish, what's the source of that power? And so his blood was swapped for the blood of well, he doesn't know, but it will be Tiamat's blood.
Of course.
And so he's directly connected to a future pathline. And so you have this rivalry of Bahamut and Tiamat, and he's not an evil character by any means. And so it's very fun to have this sort of lingering thread for him. And then, of course, last but not least, our divination wizard had a dream about pulling cards. And each one of those cards was a visual beat that could happen very easily for one of the other characters. So each character in her dream has this representation. And they're not direct. It's not like, so and so's character doing this. It's an image of a skeleton holding a book or, something very general. But then when that happens, a good note taker character like this player who's taking very copious notes while we go, you reward that. You reward that attention to detail and that memory by saying, oh, this is that moment from a year ago, when you had this dream. And that's why I gave her a lot of them in that moment. They're very general and very spread out. And one or two of them are going to happen pretty soon. And the rest of them will be whenever I feel like I need a big beat, And that's the sort of fate theme playing through is, do these moments have to happen? Do the scarier moments that you see in your mind or that are given to you in some sort of vision, are they definitely coming to pass? Or can you as a character influence that?
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing the prophecy theme to the world. And I always feel like using dreams is this cool thing you can do as a DM because
yeah, it's so fun.
People don't control their own dreams, so you have a lot more like leeway to put what you want into it for the type of stories you're trying to tell.
Yeah, and if you need like a good ending point for a session, because I love my groups, but we're very much like we'll play for 6, 7, 8 hours. If no one says, hey, I got to go to bed, like we'll just keep playing. And so if you need a reminder of this is a good, hey, at 6 hours, read the dream bit when you all go to rest. Here's the dream, and then it hooks you for the next session, and you can move on from there. That's always a great tool. But yeah, I think dreams and prophecy. I mean, prophecy within a world. Prophecy and myth, right? Like those are things that make a world feel lived in, a shared consciousness of prophecy and myth, that all these characters know. Oh yeah, we know the story of. I hate to use Harry Potter as an example, but that sort of thing, the prophecy of the boy who lived, this kind of bit.
Yeah.
That people know about that, and then you have the Star Wars sequels where the Luke Skywalker has become sort of this shared myth. When you incorporate that into your world, that it makes people feel like, oh, there's something to explore there. There's relics like the lightsaber. There's, pieces of history that play into this mythos. The absurd version of that being my last campaign, Marvel, like the MCU became folklore because my players kept in character saying to people like, oh, like Spider-Man. And I was like, this kid in this fantasy world doesn't know who Spider-Man is. You can't keep doing that. And they're like, no, like Spider-Man. I was like, okay, Spider-Man is a folk hero now, this spider creature man. And like, you had Captain America, who was like this monk with the shield and all of that. So if they referenced the MCU, that was a folklore story that was involved in the world. And those sort of things that like, then a player knows the whole MCU, right? So they can cite any part of that as folklore. And then you feel involved in the world right away. And so those sorts of moments really, really play out. So in this one, again, it wasn't my intention. I didn't come in with the plan of like this storyline is going to be all about memory and prophecy and fate. That I didn't come in with those big pillars, but they became obvious very quickly. The players really, brush the dirt away and the dust of this is general D&D. Here's what's interesting to us. And if you allow them to do that, you allow them the multiple choice hooks of some different paths that can go down. Which one really stands out to them is a good way to figure out which things to focus on.
Yeah, cool. Well, is there anything else you want to talk about that we might have missed?
Oh man, I mean, I know you get somebody on here talking about their D&D world, you talk to them all day because there's always so much to get into. I think that's it. I had some little notes. We did our questions from Discord and stuff. I had one more from a player, but I think we kind of touched on it, mostly just the idea of like a specific religious ritual that we went into as the backdrop for this murder mystery session we did. And he was just wondering like how I came up with the ritual for that. and religious ceremonies and things. And for me, that one, it was called The Dawning, and it was just the opening of a new temple. That was like I wanted to show the corruption of a particular religious group. So the traditional ritual was very inclusive of other faiths. It was, hey, we open a new temple, we invite a representative of each religion to come and sit with us and celebrate this new opening. And then the person running this one is like, I don't really want you all here, And so you make them villainous in that moment to say, hey, I had to invite you all because that's the tradition, but I don't really care if you're here or not, and you're not really welcome back. And so you get
mayor
this
of Footloose.
Exactly, yeah. You get this sort of corrupting of a particular group, and it gives your group something to remember about that event. So when you have a ritual that should be one way, but another player, one of the players grew up in this group, right? So his character would recognize this doesn't exactly sound right. And so instead of writing down a long thing and reading word for word what happens in the ritual, you can say something to the effect of like, he does this ritual, but you notice these differences, these things that are not quite right, or are a little bit less inclusive than usual. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so I work back from purpose on that, which is similar to the theme thing. It's like, once you figure out what the themes and the purposes, then you build the places, then you build what that town needs to be. So instead of, having this whole map and deciding every detail for every town, I like to work backwards from what do I need from a town this session, and what do I need from a religious ritual this session, or what details do I need to pull out to make it fit theme, and also have the resources that they want. I know a player has been desperately trying to buy a new sword, so I got to have a blacksmith in here, and just sort of every town becomes an amalgamation of thematic need and gameplay need, and then that way you have the freedom to kind of build those as you go, and then when you revisit them, how they've grown and how they've changed by adding to that or taking away from it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing that. I feel like one of the other questions I ask is like, what DM advice do you have? But I feel like you just gave that. So.
Yeah. I think that the only other like general DM advice I would say is, and I think a lot of DMs will say this, is just like, do it. Just do it. If you're like, oh, I want to play, but I have friends who maybe like the idea of playing, but nobody wants to DM, and we went on Reddit and tried to find a DM. Just one of you be the DM and switch around, or if you hate it, fine, switch off. But like, I don't do character voices. I don't do accents for different areas. I don't do that. And you don't have to be perfect at every part of DMing to be a good DM. You just have to embrace your players and embrace the absurdity of the world and the game, and allow it to be silly. Not every session is going to feel like the finale of Critical Role. Like you got to learn what D&D really feels like at a table by playing. And I think, like, especially for me, I was really nervous about that. Even getting back into it after having done it for a while, the idea of like, I'm going to DM for my friends, it's going to be embarrassing and be in front of my friends doing this. Like, no, if they want to play, they're signing up to play with you and to explore this new thing. Just do it. Just get at a table or get online. There's nothing wrong with doing it on Zoom and Roll20. That's a great way to play, and just try it out as a player, as a DM. There's nothing wrong with being new to something.
Yeah, that's some good advice there.
Oh yeah, and steal is my other. Just go online and steal. There's a reason that half of this stuff is like from the internet. I mean, there's so much fun stuff out there. Just steal. Go run the False Hydra. I have a town that's the letters are Gotham mixed up. Everything in that's going to be stolen from Batman. Just steal. It's a great way to DM. That's a good note. That's a good note to end on, is theft.
Inspired plagiarism.
Yeah, that's the nicer wording for it.
Well, yeah, I think that covers everything. Yeah, thanks for coming on the show, Tommy. It was great talking to you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a blast to explore, and it's always so fun to hear about other people's worlds and thought processes. I'm a fan now. I've been listening my way through the catalog, and like I said, I'm really excited to hear this week's about the one city thing. I mean, that, especially playing at a table of physical space, the idea of just building one town and coming back to that every week, that sounds so fun. I want to do that so bad now. I'm going to change my whole campaign to one town. Steal. That's what I'm saying. One town. I'm stealing that. No, but thank you for having me. This is a lot of fun. It's fun to explore the world and build it now I'm going to be adding things that we talked about today. I didn't make anything up today, but we'll get it there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're welcome. Thank you for coming on the show.
Awesome. Thanks. Great meeting you.
We're still looking for people to interview, so if you or someone you know might want to appear on the podcast, please let them know. Our web address is gocorral.com/STS. GOCORRAL.com/STS. Thank you.